Right, you're on.
We were going to
Yeah. No, we're on board next weekend. Right.
Okay, we're now going to get into the anchoring session where we've got 7 short talks about anchors and anchoring. So we'll kick off with Chris, and what he's got to say. Chris.
My offer to Derek was to just give two what I've learnt. And the first one was anchor length of anchor chain and rope attached to it. I learnt the hard way in that soon after I bought Blue Dolphin, I went to the Isles of Scilly, and fortunately, very fortunately, I got the last mooring buoy, and all the people next to me had to anchor in unfortunate weather, and they dragged anchors all over the place. If I'd had to anchor, I would have ended up on the rocks, because I realised that when I got back that I had inadequate. And what I learned from that was you have to obviously choose your solution depending on particularly not only your boat but where you intend to anchor. And I anchor very much in the 2 to 5 metre contours. The tide is roughly 5 metres, so the worst penetration is 10 metres, give or take. So I now have 40 metres of chain attached to 50 metres of rope, appropriate sized, 8 and 14 millimetres, which more than covers me for any eventuality. So I had a near miss possibly, and I learnt from that one. So do you know exactly what you've got? When did you last check it? And is it appropriate for where you intend to go? And the second one was is what anchor do you have? I was blissfully happy with the anchors that came with the boat, one of which was a CQR, which worked fabulous in its day. And I was quite happy minding my own business until Charles put up a forum post about a Knox anchor. And it's something interesting because I've never heard of it. And so I did some research, and it became patently obvious that the modern anchors were much better than the ancient ones. And I don't really think it makes a great deal of difference which modern one you have. The Knox is very similar to the Rockler. The Rockler, my understanding, was a New Zealand design that's now owned by a Canadian company. They both have rollover bars. You either like rollover bars or you don't. And you look at the manufacturers, and some will say they're wonderful, and some will say no, don't. But that's just manufacturers. You know, do your research. Steve, Charles, and I have wrote up in lockdown 11 the thing on Knox and Rockler. They are on the website if you're interested. Why did I choose a Knox? Well, I wanted to buy British. It's as simple as that in the end. The difference with the modern anchors, my simplistic understanding, non-engineer, is not only the shape, but it's the weight on the tip, which is roughly 45%, give or take, or something like that. And they are definitely they hold better than the older traditional stuff. So my advice to anybody is, as I think I said in the article, was if you haven't got a modern anchor and you wish to anchor, I would possibly suggest that you think about it and look at some of the YouTube stuff of how anchors drag. Fascinating. And the modern ones are definitely a quantum leap forward. So, because I tend to anchor virtually every single time I go out. But that was my 2 pennies worth.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Next up is David.
Put these photographs up.
Put it on.
Put it down.
Space there.
My talks for lessons learned in anchoring 40 years ago. And I'd like to start off about talking about mountaineering. Most of you know that in Scotland, all the mountains over 3,000 feet are called Monroes, and with 282 such peaks. And some of these, 3 of these Monroes are on the Knoydart Peninsula, which is basically opposite Skye. That's Knoydart, and it's surrounded by Loch Nevis to the south. Loch Nevis in Gaelic means heaven, and Loch Horn to the north, and Loch Horn is Gaelic for hell. And it's aptly named, particularly for sailors, because of the preponderance of vertical winds and very strange, inconsistent currents. The guidebooks say about Knoydart, whilst it's one of the most beautiful areas in Scotland, it is also one of the most inaccessible. And if you want to climb the Monroes here, you've got a 20-minute irregular ferry from Mallaig down here, or another long walk if you're coming along Loch Horn, which is about 18 miles from Kinlochhorn. In the late 1970s, 2 members of the Castle Mountaineering Club asked me if I thought it feasible to anchor near the base of Larderben, which is here. And they wanted to anchor in Barrisdale Bay. Now, if you look at the chart of Loch Horn, you can see that the areas for anchoring are very, very small. It's very deep water, and in some areas it's very shallow. So the areas where you can anchor are few and far between. Anyway, we chartered, because I didn't own a fishery in those days, 40 years ago, a Colvik Watson 28, which is similar to a fishery in many ways. It was an okay boat, but pretty basic. It had an echo sounder, it had a compass, a radio that didn't work, and that was about it. And we set off from Loch Carron, which is further north, anchored in, picked up a mooring in Plockton the next day, sailed through the Kyles of Loch Alsh, and then turned right into Loch Horn. And the climbers wanted to anchor in Barrisdale Bay, which is here. And you can see the areas of shallow. And I'd said, I don't think there'll be any problem in anchoring in Loch Horn, never having seen at that time a large-scale chart. There are no recognised anchorages in this part. There is one around here somewhere, but in actual fact it turned out to be a very, very dangerous place to anchor. Anyhow, I found 15 foot of water in Barrisdale Bay here, started to drop the hook before I realised that the anchor chain hadn't been marked in any way. So I reckoned in 15 foot, I'd put about 60 foot down. I didn't want to put too much down because of the risk of running aground somewhere. And after putting the motor in reverse, made sure there was a decent tug on the anchor chain. And following that, we had our supper, a wee drum, and went to sleep because we got an early start the next day. We knew the wind was going to be light and there shouldn't be any problem. However, when we woke up the next day, where on earth are we? None of us recognised the Cardiff echoes. And what had happened, of course, we'd dragged in the night and we'd finished up halfway between these rocks here. We could have gone aground, we could have hit a rock, anything. And so I was so thankful it took me. One should take more care with anchoring. We were very, very fortunate indeed. And my 4 lessons that I fortunately never made the mistake of again is always check the range of height and height of tide before you decide what chain to put down. Make sure the anchor chain is properly marked. And if you're sailing without a GPS, take proper bearings so you know precisely where you're anchored, and check the accuracy of the depth sounder. And finally, don't listen too much to others telling you where they'd like to stop. I'm sure fisher owners never make those mistakes, but we've all got to learn somehow. Thank you.
Okay. Terry.
Right.
Well, this is cool.
This is my bag of props. It's not very exciting enough for now. But coming from an area where they only invented the marina back in about 1980, you learn that you have to anchor. On my boat, I carry 70 odd metres of chain. When I drop anchor, the minimum I drop is 4 times the depth, and it frequently gets extended beyond that if I think there's going to be any wind that night. And I have a cunning plan. The echo sounder is set in feet. The chain is marked in metres. So I drop in 15 foot of water, I go 15 metres of chain at the bare minimum, and then I usually double it after that anyway. There's a lot to be said for actually looking at a chart before you get there. Very briefly, this year we went up the Isle of Man, Northern Ireland. Coming back from Strangford Lough in the Isle of Man, we caught a good breeze.
Northern Ireland.
Yes, sorry, Strangford in Northern Ireland. We were coming back to the Isle of Man, and what started off as a fitful sort of wind, we caught a decent one. By the time we were off Port Erin, we were sailing at 7 knots across the ground with the tide against us, jib and mizzen. The instruments said we were constantly getting 28 to 30 knots of wind. So after we'd gone through Calf Sound against the tide, I thought, Port St Mary, we'll get some shelter in there. Well, we came in and there were 2 visitors' moorings, each with a strop on them. The strops were about that long. The wind is now 40 knots, steady. And how anybody's going to get hold of that strop with a boat hook in 40 knots of wind. So I took one look, gave up, and I went for the next bay, Carricky something or other. But I'd looked at the chart, and in that bay it shows sand. We steamed in there, 40 knots of wind, steady across the whole surface of the sea was white. Scooted the anchor over, plus 50 metres of chain. Realistically, the wind was force 9. And she just came back, went bang, and that's it, and we never moved, and we had a very peaceful night, because I knew I was going in sand. And that was the thing, instead of going round, will it hold, won't it, there's a fair chance in sand that it will. I still use a plough type anchor, but it's one made by Plastimo called the Cobra, which had very good reviews years ago, and it does hold decently. I think some of the later ones might do a better job, but anything that can hold 16 tons of boat in 40 knots of wind gets my vote. Anyway, the bag of goodies, which all got jumbled up just then, so this is going to look like a rat's nest when it comes out. A lot of people have a phobia about trying to buoy an anchor when they're going into an anchorage where it's rumoured there could be old moorings or something on the bottom. And as somebody who's fouled an old mooring in years gone by and had to saw through the anchor chain with a hacksaw and leave anchor and 12 foot of chain behind, a lot of people will put their rope down to the end of the anchor as they let it go, and on the other end of it they tie a buoy or a fender and chuck it over. And then they spend the next night worrying about this rope that's looping all over the place because the tide's going up and down and it's doubling in its apparent length, that it's going to go around their rudder or the propeller or God knows what else. And there is an answer, and it's this. You have an anchor buoy. It's not a tennis ball, it's an anchor buoy with a loop on the bottom of it, and you put a shackle. I would use a heavier one than that in reality. So we'll say that you've anchored near the top of the tide, calculated it all, need longer arms for this. So there it is, it's nice and taut, it's not floating around and getting wrapped up in all your other things. And as the tide goes down, this keeps the anchor buoy taut, not free to wrap up anything. And as the tide comes back in again, it just, so it's there, it's not causing any trouble. And I would recommend the trick to anybody. It's perfectly simple, one heavy shackle, looped outside the actual buoy rope, and no matter what the tide's doing, you keep it steady. Right, that's about me. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Robert.
Sure, I'll need these. So, hang on. Black and red and pink. Red will be fine, that's fine. Right, so, I own a catfisher. I'm aware of the time, by the way, so this is going to move pretty fast. This is about an incident. So catfish, you did a quick boat building course. You get a Fisher 46 wheelhouse, and you saw the bottom of it, and you get one of those. And you create some deck that's a little bit wider, and you fill it in completely, and you put a couple of very fine hulls on, and the keels are quite neat, draws a metre, so that is how you build a catfisher. The reason I'm showing you that is maybe because you've never seen one, but also the anchoring of this. So, I've got an anchor winch there, it's now electric, but it was an ancient Simpson-Lawrence manual. A delta permanently mounted in a nice bracket, always available there. A fortress which can come from here, but usually if I use it at all, will come from that quarter, and I'll use an oversized self-tailing sheet winch for the rope. And there are davits, so you stand an excellent chance of fouling the dinghy with this one, but that's another story. So, and if you were staying any length of time, it's nice to put a bridle onto that chain to take the stress off the winch and the cleat and just generally make the whole thing tidier, a bit more symmetrical. Okay, that's the boat. Now we need the geography. Anybody sailed into Preston? Don't. Right. The River Ribble is, I can't remember, that's probably about 7 or 8 miles. At this end goes up towards Blackpool, that end down towards Liverpool. Training wall, long since silted up. The only way of getting in and out of Preston basically is through a hole in the trailing wall. It's not relevant, but you're supposed to basically line up a couple of random features on the shore and come through this hole in the knowledge that your keels won't hit the trailing wall. Up here is a dock in Preston, and there's a lock. Now, whoever decides the lock times is not a yachtsman. It depends on the trade union, the council. The tides are completely irrelevant, and it depends on which day of the week it is. Now, for some reason I don't fully remember, but this is 1998, the only time we could get out reasonably was at 5 o'clock on a Friday evening in April. So, dead easy this. Out through the lock, take the ebb down, stop for the night. What could be easier? What you do is you get your catfisher, you turn around, and you drop the delta, put on the bridle, and go to bed. And then April dawns quite early, you wake up, and the river's completely empty of water, and you walk out, and you think, what's going to happen next? Because the whole lesson was that I did not think this thing through very well. Well, the tide will come in gently, and the boat will rise a bit of a bump, just meander gently around when it's pointing the other way, bringing the anchor, off you go. And the plan was, tidal gate, we're going right across the bay, round to Holyhead. So, that's a critical day. That's probably why we needed it on that Friday. Or rather, that Saturday by the time it was then. Okay, so the tide never did come in. I don't know if you're familiar with this phenomenon. If you get a huge area of flat mud and sand, and then eventually it gets a bit deeper, the tide comes in, and then it doesn't just sort of lap over the edge, it sort of forms a meniscus. And it sits there, and suddenly, you've probably been in a bay that does this, there's an almighty whoosh. So as the day went on, morning went on, I thought, whatever's going to happen? So I put out this cage there. So we'd hang on that. And sure enough, when the water arrived, it was like the Niagara Falls in reverse. So within literally minutes, a metre had come up, and we were hanging from this cage. Right. Then, after a bit, it was time to go. So you're now firmly anchored, like fore and aft. What on earth do you do about that? Okay, no problem. So, easy. Kedge. Now, by this time the boat is actually lying like this, because of the forces on the keel and everything else. So, we're just going to let this go gently out, and then we're going to be above this anchor, and we're going to just pull it up. Okay, that's great. So now we're like this. This is on full length. It's round the winch, and it's as taut as an iron bar. There's not the slightest chance of bringing that in. Right, easy. All you have to do is put a buoy on there and drop it, and there's a great big whoosh as you fly off upstream, and you catch it, and luckily you've got the twin props on the fisher. And so then we're like this. Anchor, fender, catfisher. Now, one thing I didn't tell you, two golden features of the catfisher. One is, you can use the hulls as a catcher for a mooring or a buoy or anything. So basically you just bring the hulls up, and you get the buoy in between, and they can't go anywhere. Secondly, if you go through the forward window, from the foredeck, you can reach the gears and the throttle. Brilliant. And of course you can do the gears separately. So, how could this possibly go wrong? Well, it's sort of only me and a half, so I can't rely too much on my very keen crew member. So the first thing we notice coming up against the tide is that this buoy is actually sitting there. It's doing a sort of tiger tail. So every time we try to come up, it moves. And then you ease off a bit and you try again and it moves again. Anyway, eventually, we did actually manage to get it between the hulls. Well, of course, then you've got the business of, where is it exactly? You don't want it sort of wrapping around the props and heaven knows what else. Anyway, eventually, a boat took onto there. Well, of course, I'm trying to move the boat and the boat hook and the rope and, well, there aren't enough hands. And the boy's flying around like this and the boat's unstable, and the boat's moving backwards and forwards, and the tide is like a torrent. So anyway, eventually...
For that, you'll have to turn off aeroplane mode.
Okay, so I managed to get the rope onto the cleat. So it's going to be easy now, isn't it? The boat is attached to an anchor, all you have to do is pull the anchor. Well, I can't use the winch, and of course I thought, well, just a bit of a head on the engines, bring in some rope. Oh, no, no, no. As soon as you start doing that, the boat does this. And so it's equally tight, whatever you do. So eventually, the only thing I could do was to give a great big burst of forward, then this would pick up as a huge loop. And for about 10 seconds, you had a moment of peace. So do this like that. And then tie it onto the cleat before something else goes wrong. And then there'd be a sort of few seconds pause, and there'd be the most almighty lurch as the warp went tight again. So we spent probably an hour shortening this rope until eventually, we were sort of hanging in a normal sort of anchoring position. And of course, the nearer you get to here, the nearer it is to civilization. And of course, as the tide was rising, it was getting more civilized as well. So basically, this whole thing took 2 hours of messing around. I'm beginning to think the answer was, right at the very start, except the fact that we were going to be basically like this in a river where the current was coming, tide was coming that way, and probably just accept the fact that there might be a few bumps. I just don't know what the answer was. The bottom was not a bad sort of substance. But anyway, this just goes to show that things are never quite what they seem. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Robert.
I'll keep it off aeroplane.
Might help the aeroplane.
Have to excuse me, I'm not very good at reading in public, but I'll try my best. This is a sort of lesson I learnt quite some time ago, around about 2000. I actually, before I became a fisher owner, I had owned a fairly fast motor cruiser, but it was currently out of the water with some serious engine problems, so I was sort of getting a little bit depressed that I wasn't able to go boating. So my friend suggested that I made use of his 23-foot bilge keeler, and which we did for the summer months. And towards the end of the season, we sort of suggested that it'd be a good idea to go to Perm on the west side of the coast there and go some beers, stay the night, dry out on the beach, which would be a good idea. So that following Friday evening, I sailed from St Sampson's Harbour across the Russell, 2.8 miles to Herm. On arrival, I made the stern anchor ready because we're going to moor fore and aft on the beach. So I got the stern anchor ready, and which wasn't a particularly big anchor for the size of the boat. So I loaded that over the side with a short length of chain and slowly motored towards the beach, stopping with about a metre of water underneath the keel before getting the bow anchor ready, and then getting into a dinghy to take the bow anchor ashore to set on the beach. Once I'd done that, I then paddled back out to the boat, got back on board and set about adjusting the ropes. But while I was doing that, unknown to me, the latest invention had turned up going down the Russell, which was our fast ferry, doing top speed as it does. I was heading down towards St Peter Port, and it wasn't long after that its waves arrived. But I was sort of heading towards drying out at that point, when the waves did turn up, and basically out of nowhere it was horrendously, the sea condition went from flat calm to breaking waves crashing over the stern of the boat, which with the waves the boat was surging up and down between the moorings, the chains, the anchors. The poor little anchor couldn't hold the boat anymore and started to drag, and the boat started to surge up the beach and dried out, which is fine. That's what I wanted to do in the first place. So, thinking about it, there was nothing more I could do, so as the tide dropped out, I jumped off and went off to the pub. The next day, I reset the anchor on the low water, reset the anchor, so that I could then use the winch to pull the boat off as the tide started to rise. And when the tide came up, the anchor rope, nice and taut, started up the poor little 8 horsepower outboard, which was attached to the boat, and stuck it in reverse, and nothing happened. This was on a 9.3 metre tide, which happened to be the top of the 9.3 metre tide. And the next 9.3 metre tide was in about 5 weeks' time. So basically, I ended up having to return 5 weeks later, in 5 weeks' time, with a friend who I commandeered with his Channel Iron 32 twin-engine diesel motor cruiser and a long length of rope. Tied the rope round the keels, dug out the sand from underneath the keels so I could get the boat to physically drop to one side so it would rock as the tide came in, and we pulled the boat off. But after doing all that, the worst thing about the whole incident was prior to that was the boat was pictured in the local press under the headline, "Mystery Yacht Abandoned in Herne."
Okay, so it's my turn now. I've got some props. I've also got a little diagram which I hope you can see, but I'll probably do a bit of explanation.
What looks at?
Let's hope it stays there. Okay, I'm going to do a couple of short tales. Both have been written up in the newsletter, so the full details are there. So I'll just give a quick summary. So we're talking about anchors and stuff, so we have to have a bit of chain. This isn't my anchor chain, by the way. Far too small for that. So the first one I'm going to talk about is, have I put out enough chain? And then the second one is, how did I get my anchor unstuck when it was stuck? Okay, so have I put enough chain out? We drop our anchor, we put down the chain we think we need to put out, whichever calculation we have or estimate of amount of chain. We've heard about a few. But we look down from our bows at this chain disappearing into the water, out of sight. There's an anchor somewhere down there. Where does the chain go? Does it reach the bottom, or does it go straight to the anchor? We all know that if the anchor's in my left hand, we ideally want the chain to drop down, to touch the seabed, and then run along the seabed to the anchor, so it's pulling horizontally on the anchor. What we don't want is to be like that, which is you're pulling the anchor upwards. Now, how do we know that it's doing that? Because it doesn't go in a straight line. You can see from here, from the bow roller here, it goes in a catenary to the seabed and then along to the anchor. Now the catenary is a fancy equation. It's a catenary equation. It's well, I don't think you can see it. It's a cosh x over a minus 1. And that's, the cosh is the hyperbolic cosine function. Enough of that. As Stephen Hawking says, every time you put an equation in a book, you lose half your readers. So we won't talk about that anymore. But what I've done, having used to do maths in my old days, I've integrated along this chain, which you can do, and work out as a function of the angle of the chain at the bow, i.e. the angle that it's going down at, you can work out what the chain to depth, and on depth I'm talking about from the bow roller to the seabed, so there's the depth plus the height to the roller, what that ratio is as a function of the angle here, which is quite interesting to work out. Well, it is for me, because I do maths and stuff. And here's a table of that, which I've worked out. You don't need to see it. I can print it off or let people have it, or it's in the newsletters. And what you find out from here is that as the chain goes fairly vertically down, from sort of vertically down to 45 degrees, as long as you've got a ratio of 3 times the depth, you're okay. And most of us put up at 3 or more times the depth. As the chain gets shallower and shallower, you can get to a point where, say, at 20 degrees, you need 5.7 times the depth. So to reach the bed before, seabed before the anchor. I mean, I have been known to anchor when I've had a 20-degree angle, when it was blowing sun. It's just a way of working out where the chain goes. And I usually, if I'm a little concerned about it, I will just check the angle and then check the chart and see that I've got plenty of chain out to reach the bed, seabed before the anchor. So how do we check the angle? Ubiquitous iPhone on there. But useful to have a lanyard so in case you drop it. So that's something I just do as a check, as how much chain I should put out. But also, you could say, just put loads and loads of chain out. But then, as has been mentioned before, chain can get caught on things on the bottom, like old moorings. I was in Swanage one day, I'd been anchored there all afternoon, was just taking the anchor in to go back to the Solent. Winch going away quite happily, when all of a sudden it grinds to a halt. I thought, what's going on here? Looked over the bow, the anchor chain was going bar tight, straight down. I thought, oh dear, the anchor's stuck. So, what do? I hadn't put an anchor buoy out, as Terry was recommending, so I couldn't go to anchor buoy. But I did remember, and I wanted to try for a long time, a method that's been suggested in textbooks is using a short length of chain, and this is the actual piece of chain that I used. You put it onto a piece of rope, longer than this piece of rope, anchor chain going down bar tight, and you assume if the anchor's at the bottom there, it's holding the shank upwards. You drop this chain round the anchor chain down to the seabed. You then let your anchor chain go slack, which then would drop the shank of the anchor down, and this is then round the anchor, and the idea is you pull this, you can pull the anchor up, releasing it if it's caught on something down there. So I tried that. First time I tried it, no chance, because it's blowing quite hard that day. Tarquin blew back away from the anchor as I slackened the chain, and it just kept going, so I wasn't going to be able to do anything. So had to put a kedge anchor out. Fortunately, I had the dinghy ready, set the kedge anchor, hauled Tarquin in on the kedge to hold her directly over where the chain was baled. Again, then took the anchor chain in, dropped my chain over it down to the seabed. Then I could let the main anchor chain go slack and let that down. I then gave this a good tug, and to my relief, it came loose. So I pulled it up, expecting to find an anchor on the end. The anchor wasn't there, I just had more chain. I then realised that what had actually happened, it wasn't the anchor that was stuck, it was the chain that had actually got caught on something there. And in Swanage, there were a lot of permanent moorings there, so I guess it was an old bit of mooring that the anchor chain had got caught on. So if I hadn't had this, or been fortunate in using this, even if I'd had an anchor buoy, it wouldn't have pulled it up, because it was the chain that was stuck. Anyway, I was quite pleased to be able to get out of that situation, but the things I learned was, one, it's always useful to have your dinghy ready to go in an emergency like that, where you need to do something. If I'd had to pump the dinghy up, that would have been another half hour or an hour to get it all set up. Don't anchor where there are permanent moorings. Not a good idea. And what else do I have? Oh yes, too much chain can be a risk. So I know you could just put lots out, but it can be a risk. And the textbook method of freeing an anchor or chain or something can be quite useful. And so there we are. I found it quite. So now I think Steve is going to summarise.
Wow. I'm sure we could probably spend another 2 hours spinning very important bits about how we got it wrong with anchors. We dragged backwards in the Caribbean on a massive CQR once, and we were in a 50-ton catamaran, which wasn't much fun. And, but if you, just to summarise this, thank you very much, guys. Very, very interesting. I've learnt a couple of things, and I'm definitely going to do one of those chains. If you look at the Fisherlight series, you'll find in Lockdown 11 3 articles, one by Charles, one by Chris, and one by me, about different anchors. There are 2 very good ones about the Knox anchor. And the only reason I didn't buy a Knox anchor is because I got a good deal on a rock now. So, but fabulous stuff. Your recovering a fouled anchor was in Lockdown 7, December 20, so I'd really recommend that to you to have another read. I put a bit about anchoring in Studland, because there are some changing rules about where you are allowed to anchor and where you aren't, because of the lesser spotted snowball frog or something that's growing on the bottom. So that was in Lockdown 7. In Touchwood 4, Fisherlight TW4, you put something about Studland Bay.
I've anchored, or not anchored, I've picked up a mooring buoy there, one of the new eco-friendly mooring buoys.
Yes. Yeah, so another good read, another stonking good read. I have to say thank you to Terry. The library has at least 4 articles. Anchoring the Forgotten Art, The Art of Anchoring Parts 1 and 2, and Setting an Anchor Buoy. It's all in there, it's in the library on your website. Okay, well worth seeing. Again, Derek, on the website, have I put out enough chain? Which I thought was a brilliant article, because you brought in those angles and things. I thought that's fascinating, and I'm going to learn that equation. I'm supposed to be good at maths, but
I'll show you the workings. I've got 3 pages of workings.
And he also did one, Derek, on salvage your old anchor and chain. We've got these. White Mistress had the anchor locker when we decided to survey the anchor chain, and we got the first 40 metres out. The last 10 metres was a rusted together nest of rusty, rotten chain, which took about an hour of beating it with a club hammer and a cold chisel to get it out. And then we went down to 40 metres of chain, because we obviously never used the last 10. And things kind of worked quite well there. So a good one. There was another nice article on the website by Lauren and Sandy Acker for a Fisher North Easter Seaward from British Columbia, called Anchors Away. Tony Lapthorne, God bless him,
did one on weighing anchor and about a jockey pulley on the foredeck to get the angle of the chain right before it gets to your windlass. I did see an excellent piece by Matt Finley, who owned Fisher 34 Arctic Blue, a massively experienced worldwide sailor who actually he concluded by buying a 20 kilo Rockner for his Fisher 34 because he thought that was the best one, but there we go. I also did, some of you might remember, I did put out a quick request for an anchor survey a year or so ago, and I got 6 reports in, and you'll be pleased to know there were 2 Fisher 25s, 1 Catfisher 28, a Fisher Freewood 30, a 30 Northeaster and a 34. All different setups, 2 Knox, 2 Rockner, 1 Lumar Tor and a CQR. And all sorts of different sizes of chain. Some people loved swivels, some people hated swivels. So that, you know, you've got to really make your own mind up with all of this stuff. So I think if I had to give a prize out for who had done the best contribution over the years for anchoring, I would it would be between Terry and Derek. Over the years, you've written some amazing stuff. And it's all available to us through our brilliant website. So, you know, we're talking about how much should we pay per year just for the information on that website. In my humble view, it's worth every penny. And that's it. So thank you ever so much. I really enjoyed that, guys. Well done.